Welcome to Nobilis Erotica, the best science fiction and fantasy erotica anthology podcast in the known universe. This month's story, the most epic size difference kink story I've ever seen. This is episode 456. I am your host, Nobilis Reed. This episode of Nobilis Erotica is sponsored by the generous patronage of Nobilis Erotica listeners. To help out paying the authors and voices that create these stories, visit patreon.com/nobilis. The May patron-funded story is It Came From Beneath by Lewis Evans. Lewis is a writer, performer, and producer living in Brooklyn, late of the San Francisco Bay, where he participated in the Shipwreck parody erotic fan fiction competition and was one of the founding co-producers of the Clitoris Salon feminist reading series. He's pretty sure he could recognize a Godzilla-sized clitoris. His website is evanslewis.com, and he tweets at LewisEvansWrite. The story is narrated by Meredith Matthews, musician and creator of the Brain Douche podcast. Here we go.
It Came From Beneath by Lewis Evans. When the clitoris rose more than 2 stories high from the San Francisco Bay, someone called the National Guard. The fighter jets screamed out of the southeast, and sonic booms rippled across the city skyline. The clitoris rippled too, possibly with pleasure. Colonel Buck Harder, who was watching the clitoris through binoculars from an emergency command post atop the TransAmerica period, San Francisco's tallest building, and also, fortuitously, its most phallic, had no idea what the spasms meant. "God damn it, men," he screamed at his all-male staff. "What is that thing?" It was obviously a clitoris. Obviously. It was, at this point, nearly 15 stories tall, largely erect, and completely well-defined. Aside from its size, which could have come right out of an anatomy textbook, or a pornographic photoshoot with one of those uncomfortably invasive camera angles. Any human being with eyes who was familiar with the appearance of a clitoris would have gotten it instantly. They would have said, "Oh, yes, that's a giant clitoris." "For the love of God, what is it?" the colonel cried. The men muttered, sounding collectively like a failing outboard motor. The California National Guard was stumped. "I need theories, people. Don't make me call on you." The colonel had been a health class teacher at one point in his varied career. But health classes, sadly, do not cover the clitoris, which, after all, does not knock you up or make you sick. The inarticulate mumbling only increased. The colonel shrugged angrily and began pointing at officers at random. "It could be a large fleshy island," volunteered a major. "An excited island?" "It looks like one of those old weird laptop mice that you had to sort of flick around," said the lieutenant. "But huge and alive." "It's obviously the tip of some giant submarine penis," said the sergeant. Everybody stared at him. "Obviously," he repeated. One by one, the men surreptitiously glanced down at their own crotches, then outward at the mountain rising in the bay. The overall posture was one of awe, and fear, and inadequacy. "I suppose," the health teacher cum colonel said, "it does look sort of like a penis, somewhat." "Notably phallic," said the lieutenant. There was a chorus of nods. "Very well," the colonel said. Already he could feel decisiveness returning to his body, flooding him from his scalp to his trouser decider. "We'll proceed under that assumption. Men, a giant penis has risen out of the San Francisco Bay. What do we do?" There came a sudden, insistent pounding at the door, then the sounds of an altercation. Then a moment of silence reigned, and then the door burst open, and a remarkable figure tumbled into the room. It was a woman with tufty professorial hair and mad, staring eyes. She was wearing a white lab coat and a sort of bandolier tied together out of dental dams, which, true to theme, none of the army men recognized. The overall effect was that of Mrs. Frizzle in Albert Einstein's Love Child, as played by Kate McKinnon. "Stop, you fools!" she said, her German accent as thick as it was obviously fake. "The creature is not ein penis!" "Not a penis?" snorted the sergeant. "Then what is it?" Ah, a very miraculous thing indeed, you see. It is... Look, you can even see the foreskin. Well, the structure is homologous to the foreskin, but you see... Notice the gland-like shape of its head. Glands-like, yeah, but not ein true glans, because es ist not ein penis, es ist... Enough, shouted the colonel. It's clear that this woman has nothing interesting to say in the first half of her sentences, and I, for one, don't intend to let her finish any of them. Get her out of here. Two soldiers snapped to attention and, with difficulty, dragged the professor out by her resolute elbows. They behaved just as brainlessly obedient male soldiers have throughout history. But sure, it's the women who are silly and foolish. As she was hauled down the stairs, her voice echoed desperately behind her. Clitoris! 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 The lieutenant looked nervously from side to side. Do any of you men know what that means? Because I know what it means, of course. I just want to make sure that if any of you know, we all know the same thing. Enough of this nonsense, said Colonel Buck Harder. He was ready to buck authority and save the day. Buck harder than he had ever bucked before. What are we gonna do about this giant penis? Well, said the major, right now it's just the tip. We'll need more to emerge before we could really get a hold of the situation. I recommend sending in submarines. Then, once it surfaces, we can use some sort of sheath to help it complete its mission, as it were. Blow its load, the sergeant interjected. He was clearly trying to help. He was not helping. Yes, said Colonel Buck, that's exactly what we'll do. And he called in the Navy. From the sidewalk outside the TransAmerica pyramid, Professor Dolores Van Dyke brushed off the sleeves of her lab coat, adjusted her dental dam bandolier, and spat dismissively upwards at Colonel Buck. About half of the spit landed back on her chin. Van Dyke had been a champion spitter back in the day, but with age, her aim had weakened. "The fools," she said bitterly. "The damnable fools." Professor Van Dyke had resolved many a clitoral crisis in her day, single-handedly or double-fistedly if need be. But even with her prodigious ego, she recognized that this crisis was beyond her. She would need help. In minutes, she was down at Pier 39 at the little bar called the Salty Catch, sitting across from Captain Bess. Captain Bess was as old as sin, and the sin in question was sodomy. She had a peg leg, but that wasn't her only peg, if you know what I mean. She wore a wife-beater, denim cut-off shorts, and a 5 o'clock shadow the way a younger butch would wear a bespoke suit. She was eating fish tacos when Van Dyke entered. That wasn't a metaphor. It was seared ahi tuna, which Captain Bess had harpooned herself. For such a small, tight, poorly lit, hole-in-the-wall establishment, the cuisine was surprisingly fusion. "It is ein clitoris!" Van Dyke half shouted. "I am sure of it!" "Yep," said Bess, expertly boning the side of fish fillet and then gobbling it up, tender morsel by tender morsel. "I saw big old clitoris in the bay." "We must do something!" Bess idly spat a spare fishbone at the dartboard. "Bullseye." "Listen, Lola," Bess said. It still sent chills down Van Dyke's happy trail when Bess called her by that name. "Aren't you a little bit old to be out chasing after every clit in town? Let someone else handle it." "But you see," Van Dyke expertly explained the folly of the National Guard, and Bess's eyes grew hard and sad, like a sympathetic rock. Out in the bay, the folly was quite a bit harder on Commander Wang of the U.S. Navy. His attack sub, the USS Plunger, which is the name of a real U.S. submarine, I'm not kidding, was approaching the base of the structure visible from the surface of the bay. But the sonar readings were all wrong. "I don't understand," Wang murmured, bending over the screen, watching the sonar send out its shivering, throbbing pulse. "Where is the shaft?" The Plunger begins to move swiftly forward, resisting any attempts to change course. "Sir!" shouted the helmsman to Wang. "She is not answering the con." Even though a submarine is basically a gigantic ocean metal ding-dong that sword fights with other gigantic ocean metal ding-dongs, its pronoun is still she, because men would die if it took even a half an hour off work, but they never once say thank you. Wang stared, not even acknowledging the growing din of distress behind him. Not a shaft, he muttered. Tunnel? We're being sucked in! This news penetrated Wang's consciousness. Fire! All torpedoes! He shouted. The sub did, and bubbly death streaked out into the sea, but with no effect. The mysterious cavern rumbled, but continued to exert its undeniable attraction, and once the sub was inside, the walls began to rhythmically contract. The seals ruptured. Water poured in. The USS Plunger was the first submarine in human history to be lost to Kegels. At that very instant, hundreds of meters upward and to the east, Captain Bess's fleet was underway. Commodore Bess now. She had taken a non-hierarchical temporary recognition of leadership and wisdom from the sisterhood. She wore a dusty captain's jacket and a newsboy cap. There were roughly approximately, let's say, exactly 69 boats in the fleet. All crewed by queer women, each one gayer and more sapphic than the last. Butches and femmes, witches and glams, from chapstick to lipstick and on to every other kind of stick imaginable. Gold star lesbians, pansexual sluts, asexuals, non-binary folks, and gender-queer goddesses. The whole lot. There was a rowboat full of butch barbers coming alongside the other boats and giving everyone who needed it Imperator Furiosa-style buzz cuts. Beside them was a sailboat of queer bakers, easily skirting around a dumb joke about yeast. Bringing up the rear of that group, of course, were the vaginal candlestick makers. There was an entire boat full of drag queens who do Bieber impersonations, and another boat full of non-Bieber drag kings to make fun of them. It was like Dyke March, but on the high sea. At the prow of the lead vessel stood Bess and Van Dyke, their arms wrapped around each other in a comradely way. But, the kind of comrades who might fuck later. One by one, the boats came alongside the giant clitoris, and the women leapt from sea to fleshy shore. "You all know what we must do!" Van Dyke boomed through a megaphone. And they did. The ladies loved up on the giant clitoris. They stroked it. They licked it. They rubbed it down gently with vast silk parachutes. They set up a slip and slide from the top of the clit to the bottom, and they all took turns going down. Soon enough, the clit swelled. It rumbled. It quivered. "Keep going, ladies!" shrieked Van Dyke. She usually was not a streaker, but Bess's peg leg was stump deep inside her, and she was very excited. And just moments later, the clit heaved with a mighty spasm and threw all of the lesbians out into the bay, splashing and wet. And then, with a deep and ineffable sense of contentment, it slowly sank below the waters. Over the next several months, not much changed in San Francisco. I mean, sure, there was irrefutable evidence that the whole bay was basically Gaia's cunt, but San Francisco had either known this already, or they took it in stride. Buck Carter was demoted to private. Genital sensitivity training was required in the Army. Commander Wang and his crew were all found safe, floating in the bay, each one encased in an adult-sized amniotic sac. And late one afternoon, on an unusually warm autumn day, a grizzled sea captain and semi-retired mad scientist rowed a dinghy out into the bay together, drank wine, held hands, and watched the sunset floating just above the biggest clit in the world.
And that's our story. If your desire for fantastic erotic audio fiction isn't sated, you can get more every month over on the Patreon campaign at patreon.com/nobilis. Patrons have just started receiving chapters of My Wild Card, an erotic transformation series. You have been listening to the Nobilis Erotica podcast. The music is composed and performed by Mass Relay. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Until next time, listen hard.